The laughter came before I even pulled out my chair. "Tell me something, Elena." Richard Caldwell's voice carried easily across the dinner table, loud enough that heads turned from the far end. "Can you actually cook? Or does Greg do all the surviving in that household?" The room erupted. Crystal glasses caught the light as shoulders shook. Someone nearly spilled red wine. My husband, seated 3 chairs down, grinned into his drink, the way men do when they want credit for being a good sport without actually having to say anything. I set down my water glass, slowly, deliberately. "Only if it's harder than flying a Chinook through a whiteout at 4,000 feet. I said it casually, the way you'd mention checking the mail. More laughter, bigger this time. Richard slapped the table. Someone repeated the punchline to the person beside them. Everyone assumed I was being clever. Everyone assumed it was a joke. Everyone except one man. At the far corner of the table, Admiral Raymond Hargrove, retired, 3 stars, the kind of man whose silence commands more attention than most people's speeches, had been reaching for his bourbon. His hand stopped midair. His eyes moved from his glass to my face with the slow precision of a targeting system locking on. He knew. I didn't understand the weight of that moment until much later that evening. At the time, I was simply trying to survive another Saturday night. The dinner was at Richard and Patricia Caldwell's home in Bel Air, one of those Houston neighborhoods where the front doors cost more than most people's cars, and every backyard looks like somebody fired an interior decorator out of a cannon at a resort catalog. My husband Daniel loved these gatherings. I endured them. By the time we pulled into the driveway, my left shoulder was already aching. It had been doing that for years, a souvenir from a hard landing outside Kandahar that the surgeons had fixed well enough to function, but never quite well enough to forget. Cold fronts made it worse. So did certain dinner parties, apparently. I sat in the passenger seat for a moment before getting out. "You okay?" Daniel asked. "Shoulder." He nodded, not with concern exactly, more with the practiced acknowledgement of a man who had learned that asking follow-up questions led to conversations he didn't know how to finish. After 18 years, my pain had become background noise, present, acknowledged, never quite addressed. I smoothed my dress before stepping out. It was a good dress, navy blue, honest in the way good clothes sometimes are. A little snugger at the waist than it would have been 10 years ago. 41 years of living, including 2 deployments, 1 surgery, and several years of rehabilitation fueled primarily by hospital cafeteria food, had left their marks. I'd made peace with most of them, most days. Inside, the Caldwell home smelled like garlic butter and imported candles. Jazz drifted through invisible speakers. Men clustered near the wet bar discussing the Texans' offensive line. Women circled the kitchen island discussing renovation contractors and a restaurant that had just opened in Montrose. Patricia spotted us immediately. "Daniel, there he is," she beamed, then turned to me. "And Elena, wonderful." Not unfriendly, just ordered. Daniel first, then the wife. Within 4 minutes, Daniel had disappeared into a conversation about commercial real estate. I found myself standing near the island holding a glass of sparkling water, nodding at conversations I hadn't been invited to join. "So what do you keep yourself busy with these days, Elena?" This from a woman named Britt, whose blonde highlights caught the light like a halo designed by a marketing team. "A little of everything," I smiled. She nodded twice and turned back to the renovation contractor discussion. That was the end of that. Dinner itself seated 14 people around a table long enough to host a congressional hearing. The men sat together naturally, gravitation rather than intention. The women filled the remaining chairs. I ended up across from Richard Caldwell, who sat beside a man named Warren Price. Warren Price was the kind of person who had never served anywhere or studied anything formally, but had nonetheless arrived at ironclad opinions about the military, medicine, foreign policy, and apparently helicopter aviation, which he began expounding upon around the time the salad arrived. "Those aircraft are practically autonomous now," he announced to no one in particular. "The computers do everything. I saw a documentary." I took a bite of romaine. "The pilots are more like systems managers at this point," Warren continued. Less flying, more monitoring. I chewed slowly. Then came Richard's question about cooking, and my answer, and the laughter, and Raymond Hargrove's hand frozen above his bourbon glass. After dessert was served, Raymond leaned slightly forward. His voice was low, but the table quieted around it the way water settles when something heavy is placed nearby. Forgive me, he looked directly at me, Captain Vasquez. Every sound in the room seemed to recede. The jazz, the ice clinking, the forks, all of it faded for one strange second. My stomach tightened. Nobody had called me that in nearly a decade. Not Captain, not Vasquez, my maiden name, not the rank I had spent 6 years earning and 4 more years living inside. I managed a small smile. Not anymore, sir. Raymond studied me for one long moment, then he gave a single slow nod. I thought so. He returned to his bourbon, said nothing more. But I could feel the room recalibrating, subtle glances, whispered questions for the rest of the evening. When Daniel and I finally left, I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. Outside, the Houston air was thick and warm. Valets moved cars through the circular drive. Guests lingered near the entrance with their lingering and their goodbyes. Daniel walked ahead toward the car. I was halfway across the drive when someone said my name. Elena. I turned. Raymond Hargrove stood a few feet away. No entourage, just him and the yellow porch light. He handed me a business card. I'd appreciate a call. I looked down, clean card. Name, number, nothing decorative. He took the card back gently, produced a pen from his jacket pocket, and wrote something on the reverse. Then he returned it. 6 words. We need to talk about Fallujah 2009. The driveway tilted slightly beneath my feet. From across the lot, Daniel's voice, "You coming?" I folded the card into my palm and walked toward the car. For the first time all evening, I wasn't thinking about Richard Caldwell or Warren Price, or the kitchen island conversation, or the way my name always came second. I was thinking about Fallujah, about sand and rotor noise and radio traffic, and the weight of decisions made in seconds that your body carries for decades. And I was wondering why someone had finally decided to open that door. I didn't sleep that night. By 2 in the morning, I was at the kitchen table with coffee I didn't need, turning Raymond's card over in my hands like it might say something different if I looked long enough. Fallujah 2009. 6 words. The kind of words that don't weigh anything at all, until suddenly they weigh everything. For years I had worked very hard to leave that chapter in its box. Not from shame, not from secrecy, but because life had moved forward, or at least had moved, and I had moved with it, and at some point the momentum of the present becomes its own kind of amnesia. I heard footsteps. Daniel shuffled into the kitchen in gym shorts and an old college shirt. He opened the refrigerator and stared into it with the unfocused gaze of a man who isn't really hungry, but needs somewhere to look. Still thinking about the weird thing with the Admiral. I looked up. Is that what you took away from tonight? He pulled out a bottle of water. I mean, it was a little strange. Do you know him? We've crossed paths. Military stuff. Military stuff. He twisted the cap, nodded, satisfied. You know Richard was just kidding, right, about the cooking thing. There it was. The gentle correction. The protective reframe. The sentence that appears in the gap between what happened and what he needed to believe about the people he liked. Good night, Daniel. A beat of silence, then footsteps down the hallway, then the soft click of the bedroom door. I sat alone at the kitchen table for another hour, and I thought about erosion. Not the dramatic kind, not earthquakes or floods. The slow kind. The kind that happens 1 inch at a time across years, so gradually you don't notice until you look back and realize the cliff edge has moved. I hadn't always been invisible in my own marriage. I had once been the person Daniel introduced first, described proudly, referenced often. Somewhere in the accumulation of his career success, his social circle, his Friday golf games and client dinners, I had become an accessory. Not cruelly, not deliberately. just gradually, the way furniture rearranges itself without anyone noticing. Around 5 in the morning, I found a storage bin at the back of our closet shelf. Inside, photo albums, service records, flight logs, a folded flag, evidence of another life. I sat on the closet floor and opened the first album. There I was at 23, impossibly young, standing in front of a Chinook helicopter with paint-stained coveralls, and a grin that didn't know yet what grinning at hard things would eventually cost. I grew up in El Paso. My father installed commercial HVAC systems. My mother taught 4th grade. Neither of them had money in the traditional sense. What they had was stubbornness, the functional kind, the kind that shows up early and stays late and doesn't complain about the hours. I joined the Army at 21 because I wanted something real. After September 11th, real felt necessary in a way it had. And before, I'd been working at an insurance company filing claims and spending my lunch breaks watching the news and feeling the slow suffocation of a life that wasn't mine. The first time I sat in a helicopter cockpit, something rearranged itself inside me permanently. There is no other way to describe it. The controls felt like language I already knew. The noise, the vibration, the impossible lift, it felt like arriving somewhere I had already been in a dream. The years that followed were hard and honest and frequently terrifying, and the best years of my life. Iraq first, then Afghanistan, night operations, medical evacuations, mountain terrain, dust storms, altitudes that made the aircraft temperamental. Most of the work was unglamorous and essential. And then 2009, Fallujah, the place on Raymond's card. I closed the album. My shoulder throbbed in the pre-dawn quiet. Some memories live in your body, not just your mind. At 9 the next morning, my phone rang. Unknown number, I already knew. Captain Vasquez. His voice was exactly as it had been at dinner. No wasted warmth, no performative friendliness. Admiral, you can call me Elena. Elena, a pause. How are you holding up? Honestly confused. Good, honest is useful. I heard him exhale. I'll be direct. Your mission profile from 2009 is under final review for declassification. Your operation is one of 6 from that period being formally evaluated. I sat up straighter. I didn't know that. Most people don't until someone makes a phone call, a beat. I made several. Why? Because I read the after-action report when it first crossed my desk. I remember thinking someone should say something. Nobody did. Time passed. These things get buried under the next crisis and the one after that. His voice didn't apologize, just stated, I'm trying to correct that. Admirals. Raymond. Raymond, I rubbed the bridge of my nose. I haven't flown in 6 years. I'm aware. I'm not the same person. A pause, then. That's where I disagree with you. I didn't answer. There's a Veterans Military Heritage Foundation hosting a recognition event in Houston next month, he continued. The board is honoring veterans connected to recently declassified operations. Your name is on the list. No. You haven't heard the details. I don't need them. You deserve this recognition. Something sharp moved through my chest. Not anger, something closer to grief. Raymond, I live in a neighborhood where my husband's friends ask me if I can cook at dinner parties. I am not, I stopped, restarted. I'm not that person anymore. Silence, long enough to have weight. Then, you know what tired sounds like, Elena. What? Exactly like you, right now. The words landed somewhere unguarded. Because they were true. I was tired. Not from age, not from injury. Tired from years of compressing myself into whatever space the room assigned me, tired of my own silence about who I had been, tired of carrying something I wasn't allowed to set down. Raymond let the quiet sit between us for a full 10 seconds. Then he said, one more thing, the event has a primary sponsor. Okay. Caldwell Commercial Group. My heart stopped. Richard and Patricia Caldwell. His voice remained measured. Apparently their company has been a foundation sponsor for 3 years. I stared at the kitchen wall. Your husband doesn't know yet, Raymond said carefully. And as of this morning, I don't believe Richard Caldwell has reviewed the full honoree list. The room felt suddenly very quiet. I see, I said. I thought you might. After we hung up, I sat motionless at the kitchen table for a long time. The morning light moved across the floor. A neighbor's lawn mower started up somewhere outside. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment, because the easy version, the satisfying version, would be to call it revenge. It wasn't. It was closer to recognition. The realization that the story I had been living quietly, invisibly, in the background of someone else's narrative, was about to walk through the front door. And for the first time in a long while, I decided not to hold it back. I didn't tell Daniel about Raymond's call. I told myself I wasn't hiding anything, and mostly that was true. I simply wanted something that was mine. One piece of my own story that hadn't already been touched and softened and filed away somewhere convenient. When Raymond invited me to meet him at a veterans' breakfast in Sugarland the following Thursday, I went. I told Daniel I had a physical therapy appointment, which wasn't entirely untrue. My shoulder had been in bad shape all week. The breakfast was at a VFW post off Highway 59, low brick building, faded flags flanking the entrance, parking lot full of trucks with worn bumper stickers. Inside, weak coffee, overcooked eggs, folding chairs that protested every time someone shifted their weight. I loved it immediately. There was a man near tea. He coffee urns with a hearing aid that whistled every few minutes. Two women in army caps were arguing about VA parking lot redesigns with the focused intensity of people who had argued about far worse. An older Marine with a cane was telling a joke for what appeared to be at least the third time that morning, and everyone around him was laughing just as hard as they had the first two times. Nobody needed me to explain why I stood up slowly. Raymond waved from a corner table. He had 2 coffees waiting. You look better, he said. Lower bar, I replied, sitting across from him. He opened a leather folder and produced several documents. Unclassified, public-facing summaries, he explained. Seeing my name in that font on that kind of paper made something tighten in my throat. You remember the mission, he said. It wasn't a question. Every second of it. Then you know what those men would say if they were in this room right now. I looked away. Outside the window, a truck pulled slowly out of the parking lot. An American flag decal on the rear window caught the morning light. The pilot who stayed, Raymond said quietly. That's what the report called you in the unofficial notes. Don't. I'm not flattering you, I'm quoting documentation. I turned back to him. What do you actually want from me? I want you to stop pretending that evening in Fallujah didn't happen. His voice wasn't sharp, it was patient. Because it did, and the people in that room deserve to have it acknowledged, and so do you. We sat in silence for a moment. The Marine with the cane finished his third telling of the joke. Laughter rippled through the corner of the room. Finally, Raymond said, You know how I recognized you last Saturday? The name helped, I assume. Partly, mostly it was the way you answered Richard's question. I waited. People who invent military experience always oversell it. Too many details, too much color, too eager. He met my eyes. You said it like someone remembering weather. Flat, accurate, unbothered by whether anyone believed you. I hadn't meant to say it at all. The line had come out reflexively, muscle memory from years of deflecting without deflecting, of carrying something heavy without letting anyone see the weight. I didn't want anyone to know, I said. Why? Because then they ask questions. And questions are a problem. Questions from people like Richard Caldwell are invitations to perform. I'm done performing. Raymond nodded slowly. Then let me rephrase the offer. Don't do it for the audience. Do it for the record. Do it so it exists somewhere outside your storage bin. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, Fine. The weeks between that breakfast and the ceremony were strange in the way that pre-weather can be strange. The sky looks normal, but the air pressure is all wrong. Daniel became more invested in the foundation event than I would have predicted, entirely for the wrong reasons. Networking, sponsorship visibility, potential construction contracts. Every evening he came home with updates about which developers had RSVP'd, which council members were confirmed, how many media outlets had requested credentials. "This could be huge for us," he said one night, setting a folder on the counter while I made dinner. "For Caldwell's group. For us, we're a co-sponsor. Our name is literally in the program." He had still not read the program. One afternoon, I stopped by his office to drop off dry cleaning he'd left in my car. Daniel's company, Meridian Structural Consulting, had outgrown 3 locations in the past decade and now occupied a glass-walled suite in Galleria that smelled like fresh carpet and ambition. His assistant waved me back. "He's on a call, but you can leave things in his office." I pushed open the door and stood for a moment inside the room that told his story. Framed magazine features, Regional Business Award, photo with the mayor, a shadow box containing his old Army uniform, patches from his 2 years of domestic stateside service, displayed with the gravity of a combat veteran's memorial. I looked at that shadow box for a long time. Daniel had served. I want to be fair about that. He wore the uniform, completed his obligation, served honorably. But I had watched him over the years allow comfortable assumptions to form around that service, assumptions he never corrected, implications he never challenged. At cocktail parties, he had learned that modest silence in response to "combat guy" read as confirmation rather than correction. He had learned to let the silhouette of a soldier stand in for a more complicated truth. Meanwhile, the photo of me in my flight suit, the one that used to sit on his credenza, was gone. I noticed its absence the way you notice a missing tooth, the space where it was felt wrong in a specific, functional way. I checked our shared photo archive that evening. Some files remained: vacations, holiday gatherings, Daniel shack. Ing hands with donors. But the cockpit photo was gone. The promotion ceremony images were missing. The photo taken after we returned from Afghanistan, the one where I looked so exhausted and so real I barely recognized myself, had been removed. Not all my military photographs, just the ones where I looked like someone who couldn't be dismissed. Daniel came in while I was staring at the screen. "Want to order Thai?" I closed the laptop. "Sure." Because sometimes the marriage is exactly that. A woman who has just discovered the shape of her own erasure, and a man asking about dinner, and the strange, ordinary evening that continues anyway. 1 week before the ceremony, we attended a garden party at the Caldwells. Warren Price found me by the hors d'oeuvres table. "Elena, our aviation comedian." He pointed a shrimp at me. "You know those Chinooks are basically flying buses. The avionics do everything now." I tilted my head. Have you ever auto-rotated a twin rotor through a dust storm with zero visibility and a hydraulic fault? Warren blinked. "Well, not personally." That's usually where the brochure stops being helpful. For one suspended moment, Warren Price's face went entirely blank. Then he laughed too loudly and excused himself for a drink refill. I should have felt something satisfying. Instead, I felt the particular tiredness of a person who has been having the same conversation for a decade, with different men, wearing the same expression. That evening, I came home to find the formal invitation waiting on the kitchen counter. Military Aviation Heritage Foundation, Annual Recognition Ceremony Guest of Honor, Captain Elena Vasquez. My hands were completely steady as I held it. I'm not sure why. I had known it was coming. And yet seeing my name, my real name, my rank, the title I had not used in years, on heavy cream paper under a foundation letterhead did something quiet and significant to my chest. At the bottom of the page, in the sponsors list, Caldwell Commercial Group, premier sponsor. I sat down at the kitchen table. The house was empty. Evening light came through the windows at a low angle, striping the floor. I held the invitation for a very long time, not planning, not plotting, just sitting with it, the way you sit with something that is both long overdue and somehow surprising anyway. I want to be clear about something. I had no master plan. What I had was exhaustion and honesty, and a retired 3-star admiral who had made some phone calls. For several days I went about my ordinary life. grocery runs, insurance paperwork, my shoulder PT appointment, a real one this time. I folded laundry, I made coffee. I had a conversation with my mother in El Paso about her neighbor's new fence, nothing dramatic. The only difference was what I carried internally, a quiet knowledge, a sealed envelope that had not yet been opened in Daniel's direction. Some days I thought I was being passive-aggressive and should simply sit down and tell him everything. Other days I thought I had spent 18 years rushing to protect Daniel from discomfort, and perhaps he was capable of handling truth without a cushion this time. A week before the ceremony, I met Raymond for coffee near Rice University. We sat outside at a small cafe populated by graduate students and people old enough to have stopped caring what anyone thought of their coffee order. "You look troubled," he said, in the way of a man who had spent decades reading faces across briefing tables. "I keep wondering if I'm doing this wrong." "Doing what wrong?" Not telling him, I stared into my cup. Part of me wants Daniel to feel what I've felt. That's not exactly a noble motivation. Raymond stirred his coffee. He did not rush to reassure me. There'd only be shame in it if you built your life around that feeling. A passing reaction is human. I nodded slowly. He looked out toward the street. Students cycled past. A dog sat patiently outside a bookshop. "You know why my first marriage ended?" I looked up. "No." "Because I treated my wife like support infrastructure." He said it plainly, without drama. "I wasn't cruel, I was faithful, I provided, I believed that was sufficient." "Sounds like a reasonable contract." "It's not a contract, it's a minimum." He paused. "I assumed she'd always be there. I treated her work, her identity, her history, as footnotes in my own chapter." He was quiet for a moment. "She left eventually. I spent years after that understanding that a man can do real damage without ever raising his voice or breaking a vow." I said nothing. The comparison didn't need pointing out. "What destroys a man," Raymond continued, "isn't being held accountable, it's refusing to grow after." He looked at me steadily. "Daniel may surprise you. Or he may not. Either way, you'll know." The ceremony was held at the Air and Space Center downtown, a building whose lobby featured a full-scale aircraft suspended from the ceiling and a light quality that made everyone look slightly historic. Nearly 300 people filled the main hall. Veterans, families, foundation donors, city officials, 2 state legislators, a camera crew from the local NBC affiliate. American flags lined both sides of the entryway. Volunteers in navy blazers guided guests toward their seats with the practiced calm of people who had done this before and understood its weight. I arrived early. My hands were steady, my shoulder ached, my dress was the right dress. Raymond found me near the entrance. "You look nervous." "I am nervous." "Good," he straightened his cufflink. "Means you're taking it seriously instead of performing it." I appreciated that distinction more than I could explain. Daniel arrived with Richard and Patricia Caldwell, Warren Price, and 3 business associates I recognized from firm events. The moment Richard spotted me standing beside Raymond, something moved across his face in sequence: confusion, recalibration, the beginning of something uncomfortable. Daniel approached me separately. His smile was the careful kind, the kind men deploy when they're not quite sure what's happening but want credit for being gracious about it. "You look beautiful," he said. "Thank you." Raymond shook Daniel's hand with the precise warmth of a man who had no quarrel with him personally and no illusions about the evening ahead. We took our seats, the lights dimmed, the program began. Several veterans were recognized first. A scholarship was announced. A moment of silence was observed for those lost. Then Raymond walked to the stage. The room settled in a way rooms do when they recognize authority that doesn't announce itself. He spoke about service without romanticizing it, about duty without making it abstract. He spoke the way men speak when they've actually been present for the things they're describing, with specific weight, without decoration. Then he moved into the story. Fallujah, 2009. A joint extraction operation. A deteriorating situation on the ground. Communication gaps. A weather window closing faster than projected, Americans who needed extraction, a pilot who had every operational justification to turn back and didn't. I felt my pulse in my throat. Raymond never used the word hero. I respected that. Heroes exist in clean narratives. What actually happened in Fallujah in 2009 was chaotic and terrifying and involved people doing their jobs well under circumstances that made their jobs nearly impossible. That is not the same as heroism. It is its own worthy thing, and it does not require the costume. The pilot involved, Raymond said, his voice carrying through 300 people without effort, spent years not mentioning it. Not because of false modesty. Because she moved on, the way soldiers do, and the world moved with her, and eventually the record got quiet. Nobody in the room was checking their phone. The record should not stay quiet. He looked toward my table. Captain Elena Vasquez. The applause started before I reached my feet. By the time I was standing, 300 people were on theirs. The sound was physical, it pressed against my chest, it filled the specific empty space that had been growing there for a decade. I looked toward Daniel's table. Richard Caldwell's expression was the expression of a man who has just understood a joke that was not meant to be funny. Warren Price looked like someone had unplugged him at the base. Patricia Caldwell had both hands over her mouth. Daniel looked devastated, not with me, with himself. That was the difference, and it mattered enormously. Raymond handed me the award, a simple plaque, nothing ornate, and stepped back. 300 people waited. I am not a natural speaker. I want to say that clearly, because everything that followed came out the way real things come out, imperfectly, without rehearsal, from somewhere underneath the prepared version of yourself. I said I didn't know how to give speeches. A few people laughed, the tension released slightly. I said nobody does these things alone, and I meant it. I talked about crew chiefs and mechanics and medics. I talked about the people who kept the aircraft flying so that the person inside the cockpit could focus on the 50 other things that needed focusing on simultaneously. I talked about families who carried invisible weight. I talked about the people who never came home. I kept it short, I kept it honest. When I finished, the warmth in the room felt different from applause. More personal, less performance. Afterward, in the current of handshakes and photographs and conversations, I watched the evening collect its meaning. A reporter caught Richard Caldwell near the bar. I couldn't hear the exchange, only pieces. Did you know? Your firm's sponsorship. All along. Richard answered with careful sentences and a loosened collar. Then he attempted a joke, something about how he'd always suspected I was more than a dinner guest, and it landed in absolute silence. Not one person laughed. Not one. Raymond happened to be passing within earshot. He looked in Richard's direction once, the way experienced people look at things that disappoint them, and Richard suddenly became deeply interested in the tablecloth. Warren Price found me 20 minutes later. He looked genuinely uncomfortable in a way that wasn't performative, and I respected that. Elena, he said. Warren. He shifted his weight, opened his mouth, closed it, then, I owe you a real apology, not a polished one, an actual one. I waited. I talked about aircraft like I knew something. I didn't know anything. He met my eyes, and I'm sorry. I tilted my head. The Chinook does have good avionics, actually. He blinked, then surprised us both by laughing, a real laugh, the kind without armor. I deserved that, he said. A little. We shook hands, not friends, but something honest which was worth more in that moment. I found Daniel in a corridor off the main hall, standing alone near a display case of vintage flight instruments. His tie was loosened. He was staring at a compass mounted behind glass, with the focus of a man who needed something small and mechanical to look at. I stopped a few feet away. We stood in the low hum of the building's ventilation system and the distant murmur of 300 people, and I waited. Finally he turned. The look on his face was not what I had expected. I had prepared for defensiveness, for hurt pride, for the negotiating look men use when they're reassembling their position. What I saw instead was grief, clean, undefended grief. I was scared, he said. I said nothing. Not of you, he swallowed. Of standing next to you, of the way people would recalibrate. He looked away. I kept thinking if they understood who you actually were, they'd wonder what you were doing with me. The honesty of it disarmed me completely. I let a moment pass before I spoke. What hurt me wasn't that you felt small. He closed his eyes. It was that you managed it by making me smaller. The words sat between us in the corridor. Neither of us moved. Then Daniel asked the question that had been building since he'd stood in his home office holding the program with my name on it. Are you leaving me? I looked at him for a long time. The man I had chosen at 23 and grown with, and argued with, and shared 18 years of ordinary, extraordinary life with. The man who had hurt me without understanding that he was hurting me, which was both a partial excuse and not really an excuse at all. I'm deciding, I said, whether I still respect you. He had no answer for that. And the fact that he didn't try to fabricate one was the most honest thing that had happened between us in years. 3 weeks after the ceremony, life looked remarkably unremarkable from the outside. The sun came up, groceries needed buying. The coffee maker developed a mysterious gurgle that turned out to be easily fixed. Daniel's firm landed a contract. My shoulder had a good week followed by a bad one. The ordinary machinery of a life kept running. The difference, and it was a real difference, was that I had stopped running it from a crouch. The phone calls came in waves during the first week. Former crew members, veterans from my unit, a flight instructor from Fort Rucker who said, "Took you long enough," and meant it entirely as a compliment. I returned every call. The conversations were strange and warm and sometimes made me cry in the driveway before going inside, which I considered entirely acceptable. Richard Caldwell sent a letter. Formal, carefully worded, 3 paragraphs. The phrase "I had no idea" appeared twice. The phrase "I hope we can move forward" appeared once. The sincerity was somewhere between genuine and strategic, which is where most apologies from men like Richard tend to land. I read it twice, acknowledged it was better than nothing, and put it in a drawer. Warren Price sent a book, A History of Army Aviation in the Gulf War Era, with a post-it note inside that said "Only still learning." That one I kept on the counter for a week before shelving it, which felt like the right proportion of appreciation. Some people from Daniel's social circle disappeared quietly. Certain invitations stopped coming. A few business connections created polite distance. Nobody made announcements. People simply redistributed themselves according to what they actually valued, which turned out to be a useful, if somewhat delayed, revelation. I did not miss any of them. Daniel started seeing a therapist. Not because I issued an ultimatum, I hadn't. He announced it one morning over coffee with the expression of a man approaching something he would rather not approach, but has decided not to avoid. The sessions apparently involved a great deal of uncomfortable self-examination. He came home from the first few looking like he'd gone 7 rounds, with an opponent he couldn't hit back. One evening he sat down across from me at the kitchen table and said, "I have a habit, apparently, of treating the people I love like supporting characters." "Apparently," I said. He smiled slightly. "The apparently is fair." Then his expression shifted into something more serious. "I didn't know I was doing it. I want to be very clear that I actually didn't know." He looked at me steadily. "And I also want to be clear that not knowing doesn't make it okay." Both of those things were true. The first didn't cancel the second, and the second didn't erase the first. That's the complicated arithmetic of damage between people who love each other. Whether Daniel changed permanently was not a question I could answer that evening. But he was finally in the room with the question, which was more than he had been before. I started attending a monthly gathering of female veterans in Sugarland. The group met in the back room of a barbecue restaurant that served excellent ribs and kept the coffee strong enough to make structural decisions by. About 15 women showed up each month: Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, different decades, different stories, the same recurring themes. We talked about everything: joint pain and retirement paperwork, and the experience of feeling 25 in your memories while your knee files its own separate complaint. We talked about the strange double life of women who had done significant things and then returned to a civilian world, that seemed structurally uninterested in hearing about them. We talked about our children and our marriages and the VA and the dreams that still woke us at 3 in the morning. Nobody there treated me like a guest of honor. Nobody treated me like a cautionary tale. Nobody asked what Daniel did for work, or whether I had kids, or what I kept myself busy with these days. They just talked to me. I cannot adequately explain how much that mattered. One afternoon after a meeting, Raymond joined me for lunch at a barbecue spot he had driven 40 minutes for, which told me everything I needed to know about his priorities. We sat at a sticky table with paper napkins and ate brisket that was worth every mile. "You seem different," he said. "Lighter," I said. He nodded. "I've been thinking about what happened at the ceremony." The standing ovation, or Richard Caldwell's face when nobody laughed at his joke. Raymond smiled, just barely. "I've been thinking about what you actually did." I waited. "People keep saying you got your recognition, got your moment." He cut a piece of brisket carefully. "I don't think that's the right frame." "What's the right frame?" He looked up. "You recovered evidence." I stared at him. "Evidence of yourself." He set down his fork. "Not the version that got trimmed to fit into cocktail party conversations, the actual record." He met my eyes. "The ceremony didn't create something new. It surfaced what already existed." I sat with that for a long moment. He was right. I hadn't become someone new that evening at the Air and Space Center. I hadn't earned something I hadn't already earned. What happened was that a true thing, a documented, verifiable, irreversible true thing, had been spoken aloud in a room full of witnesses. And I had stood there and received it without apologizing for taking up the space. That was new. The conversation with Daniel, the real one, happened on a Sunday morning about a month after the ceremony. No agenda, no manufactured moment. Just coffee and honesty, and the particular courage of two people who have decided to find out what's left. I laid out my terms clearly, not as accusations, as facts. No more diminishment disguised as humor. No more silence when someone crosses a line. No more treating my history as an inconvenient subplot. No more editing me out of our shared story to make his version more comfortable. Daniel listened to all of it without interruption, which took effort I could see. Then he said, "Agreed, all of it." The test would not be that morning's agreement. The test would be every subsequent morning. But it was a beginning, and beginnings have their own particular worth. These days my shoulder still reports the weather before the meteorologists do. I still make involuntary sounds getting out of low chairs. I still occasionally catch my reflection in the wrong lighting and have a complicated 30 seconds about what 41 looks like from the inside versus the outside. None of that has changed. What changed is smaller and larger at the same time. I stopped agreeing to be summarized. I spent years telling myself I'd matured beyond needing recognition, that requiring acknowledgement was vanity, that real strength meant being fine with invisibility. Sometimes that's wisdom. Sometimes it's the story you tell yourself while you hand over territory that was never meant to be surrendered. The hardest mission of my life did not take place over Fallujah in 2009. That was demanding and frightening and consequential. But I was trained for it. I had coordinates, crew, communication, a plan. Nobody trains you to remember who you are after a decade of slow forgetting. Nobody gives you a checklist for the morning you open a storage bin and find the evidence of yourself and have to decide whether to carry it back into the light. That mission, the one I almost didn't survive, required a retired admiral with sharp eyes and a business card and 6 words written on the back of it. And it required me to finally stop waving warning flags in front of incoming truth. My name is Elena Vasquez Mitchell, Captain, United States Army, retired. And this time when I say it, I don't lower my voice. If you've ever looked up from your life and realized that the person you were, the real, full, capable, documented version of yourself, has been quietly edited out of the story, I want you to know something. The record still exists. Somewhere in a storage bin, in a folder, in the memory of someone who was there, the evidence is waiting. Go find it. And then, for the love of everything, stop apologizing for how much space it takes up. Thank you for spending this time here. Take good care of yourself.